Hello, class. This is your professor, Professor Fisher, and this is chapter 15. We have been dealing with the nervous system with our introduction to the nervous system, chapter 11, going into the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, the autonomic, um, and all the different sections of the nervous system. And now we get into what we call the special senses. If you remember when we talked about in chapter 11, also in chapter 12, we mentioned the cranial nerves. So those play a huge role in what we call the special senses. All right, we're going to start off with the comparison of the general and special senses. So what we have here, special senses, they deal with a specific stimuli, very specific stimuli, right? So when we talk about special senses, we're going to talk about taste, for instance. So that is a very specific stimuli. You can't taste with your hands, you can't taste with your feet, you can't taste with your hair, with your eyes. You only taste with your tongue primarily. Your sense of smell can amplify your sense of taste, and we'll talk about that. But something like taste, gustation, is a special sense. Smell happens through your nose. You don't smell with your ears, you don't smell with your hands, you don't smell with your feet, you smell with your nose. All right, so these are very specialized sensory organs, which are in specific locations. So we taste with our tongue, we smell with our nose, we hear with our ears, for instance. So those are considered special senses. General senses are a little bit different, and basically in the stimuli detected. So general senses involve detection of touch, pain, temperature. These are things you can do with multiple parts of your body. I can sense touch with my fingers. I can sense touch with my feet. I can sense touch with my upper arm, with my legs. If something touches there, I can sense temperature with those areas as well. So these are considered general senses. Okay. Also, your structure of sensory receptors. Special senses have special receptors, right? That are not neurons. General sensory receptors are receptive ends of sensory neurons, right? We're going to talk about how those differ, and then also the location of sensory nerves. Special sensory organs are confined to the head. So we think of hearing, smelling, tasting, seeing, all right? So all the information travels on axons of various cranial nerves. I already mentioned the cranial nerves. You have an insight to the cranial nerves. General sensory information in contrast, general sensory information travels on axons of both cranial and spinal nerves. So things like sense of touch could be transmitted through some spinal nerves and through some cranial nerves. Remember, the cranial nerves are nerves that go straight to the brain. They don't go through the spinal cord. Sensory transduction is also an important concept. Okay, so physical or chemical stimulus is converted into an action potential that can be interpreted by the brain, right? So we need to convert a smell into a signal that can be transmitted and interpreted by the brain. Same thing with sense of taste, your hearing. All of these different senses are converted into something that can be understood by the brain. So neurons involved in general senses are specialized receptive endings for touch, temperature, and pain. Stimuli alters resting membrane potential, produce an action potential that reaches the CNS. Special senses also detect light, chemicals, or sounds and transduce them into action potentials, right? So they change a sound into an action potential that can be sent to the brain. They change a smell into an action potential. They change a taste into an action potential, which is amazing when you think about it. I taste something, it turns into a signal that goes to the brain. My brain can decipher and say, ooh, that was it. That was strawberries. Amazing. Both your general and most of your special, their stimuli are processed by sensory nuclei. They're sensed, remember sensory going towards, sending signals towards the brain, transmitted to the thalamus as part of your diencephalon. And then the thalamus, remember, is sort of like the thalamus in your brain is sort of like the control center to direct which part of your cerebral cortex that it's going to go to, right? So it goes to your thalamus, and then from your sensory nuclei to the thalamus to the primary cortex. Sensory signals are then passed to association areas for further interpretation and integration. So this is the general chart for how general senses, so if I touch something, how that's transmitted, receptive ends of a sensory neuron, axonic neurons of the spinal or cranial nerves, versus special senses, you have specialized receptor cells, taste buds, the receptor cells in your ears for sound, smell, which then send a signal, gets transduced into a signal that goes along the axon, sends a signal through the nerves. And then this is your smell, which has olfactory, not old, but olfactory nerve endings, send a signal through the cranial nerves and then eventually to the CNS. Notice PNS receives a signal, sends a signal to the CNS, central nervous system, for processing. So let's go into the anatomy of the smell. Remember, smell was one of the most direct ones. It's very similar to a general sense, but it's a little bit different. We do consider it a special sense, even though it's a similar setup, very close to setup to a general sense. All right, so what do we have? We have, in our sense of smell, we have the olfactory system, allows for detection of odorants in the air. So it takes the smells in the air, transduces them into signals perceived as odors. Somebody cooks something, somebody's cooking something, there's an odorant in the air. My nose transduces that into a signal. I smell it, my brain processes it and says, oh, somebody's cooking some lasagna, for instance. So olfaction, initiated at the olfactory epithelium. Epithelium, remember, on the surface, small region of specialized cells in your superior nasal cavity. There's 3 cell types. We have olfactory neurons, modified bipolar neurons. Chemoreceptors detect chemical substances perceived as odors. There's also basal cells, Stem cells continually replace these olfactory neurons because they only live 30 to 60 days. And we also have some supporting cells, some columnar cells. Remember, epithelial cells, we know them by their shape: squamous, cuboidal, columnar. So you have these supporting cells, columnar cells, surround your olfactory neurons. Right? So you have the neurons, primarily chemoreceptors, which are detecting the smell, basal cells, stem cells, which will become, which will replace the olfactory neurons. And then we also have supporting cells, okay? Olfactory epithelium and its anatomical structure. We have olfactory nerve. That's your cranial nerve 1, your first cranial nerve, combined axons of olfactory neurons. We have the olfactory bulb, sits above the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, inferior to the frontal lobe of brain. And the olfactory tract, axons. Remember, every nerve has 3 parts: axons, soma cell body, neurons. So we have the olfactory tract, axons that exit olfactory bulb, travel to other regions of CNS for interpretation. Right? We not only have to take a smell, transduce it into a signal, but then we also have to interpret it. All right, so this is the structure here. Cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, just showing you the location, basically at the top of your, inside your nasal cavity, the top of your nose. And we'll talk about the nasal cavity more when we get into the pulmonary system. So you inhale something called an odorant, which is basically some chemical. You inhale it. You have what you call here, see the olfactory bulb, and then you have the olfactory tract. And so looking at it, expanded view, we have the basal cells, which will help form new ones when necessary. The dendrites, remember we receive signals with the dendrite section of the neuron. Supporting cells, keep it in place. Olfactory neuron, olfactory gland. It's all part of the olfactory epithelium. You have the axon of olfactory neuron. So it's the axon. So it's this is dendrite is coming in contact with the odorant, sending a signal. There's the axon that sends a signal. Cribriform plate, that's the sort of the top bone structure inside your nasal cavity. And then we have what we call the olfactory tract. So this is the bulb and the tract, which is going to carry the signal to the brain. So let's talk about the physiology. All right, so we have odorants are in inhaled air are detected by these olfactory neurons. This chemical stimuli, so this whatever it is that's floating in the air, that's giving off this smell, this chemical stimuli transduced to electrical signals. Transduces means change. So we this chemical that's floating around the air, whether that's that's floated off of you're cooking lasagna, you're cooking pork chops, you're cooking salmon, and chemicals are coming into the air, which we call odorants, float around, they get into your nose, and the dendrites and these olfactory neurons help transduce that into a signal that is sent along your that is sent, as you see here, these olfactory neurons are sent to your olfactory bulb and olfactory tract. Right. So how does that happen? Right. And then that's transmitted to various regions of the brain. right? So activation of olfactory receptors. Odorants are dissolved in mucus surrounding the olfactory neurons cilia, right? Odorant binding proteins transport odorants through mucus to receptors on cilia of olfactory neurons. So these chemicals from this cooked food dissolves in the mucus in your nose, and then proteins transport the odorants to the mucus to the receptors on cilia of the olfactory neuron. And then here's how the transduction happens. So the binding of the odorant to the receptors activates this G protein. This triggers the enzyme adenylate cyclase to convert ATP to cyclic AMP, opens the ion channels. Remember action potentials. Now we have sodium and calcium enters the cell, causes depolarization. Action potential generated if threshold is reached, so enough of that odorant gets into your nose, causes an action potential. Once action potential is generated, odorant has been transduced from chemical stimulus to electrical signal. All right, so this is how we get from a chemical, you're cooking, you release, particles in the air, chemicals, gets in your nose, dissolves in the mucus, and then causes this binding to the G protein, cyclic AMP. The G protein triggers the adenylate cyclase, convert ATP into cyclic AMP, opens the ion channels, sodium, calcium enter. If enough enters, we have an action potential, and now your body has transduced that chemical signal into an electrical signal that can be sent to your brain. And once that happens, then we can identify that we smell something. Something smells good. Somebody cooking. So we have the diagram here. Binding of the odorant to its receptor activates the G protein. Activated G protein triggers adenylate cyclase. The CMP opens up the ion channels, and once those ions come in, those positive ions come in, that negative 70 millivolts goes up. If you get to negative 55, we've hit the threshold, we depolarize, we have an action potential. So what is the pathway? So the neural signals carry that olfactory information to various regions of the brain, right? So that you can identify what actually you are smelling. And this is all happening really fast once an action potential is generated. So axons of the olfactory neurons carry olfactory stimuli to olfactory bulb in CNS. Olfactory neuron axon terminal synapse with the dendrites of what we call the mitral cells, neurons in the olfactory bulb. Those mitral cell axons form bulk of the olfactory tract. So this is just basically sending the signal, travels between olfactory bulb and primary olfactory cortex in the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is part of your cerebrum. All right, so this is just how we get from your nose to your brain. Olfactory tract is only sensory. It's only sensory pathway that bypasses the thalamus. Right, so your primary olfactory cortex, responsible for awareness, identification of odor. We go straight to the cerebrum, so we bypass the thalamus. And so we have amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, components of the limbic system receive information from this primary olfactory cortex, and you can get an emotional or even visceral responses to odors. Like, ooh, that smells good. It made me want to kiss you. So You can have your brain can do a lot with just a smell, and we'll see this connection with a lot of the special senses. This is we always talk about issues that could potentially arise. Um, with the coronavirus, they talked about one of the symptoms being a lack of sense of smell, losing your sense of smell, or maybe it was sense of taste. Oops, I could be wrong. I think it was sense of smell and sense of taste. I think it was both. But the lack of sense of smell is called anosmia, which can be serious. So people with anosmia may not be able to detect smoke or spoil food. And because your sense of smell contributes to your sense of taste, people lose that desire. You know, we smell something and then we want to eat it. That's part emotional. That's also part, your body wanting to take care of itself, wanting to provide food for itself as necessary. So that can be dangerous in some ways. If the room was smoky, obviously, and I couldn't smell it, I would, and there was a fire going on, I didn't feel the heat, uh, and I couldn't smell the smoke, then I could get in trouble. So, since your sense of smell can be very important, um, there are many conditions that result in anosmia or hyposmia. Um, Hypo is less than, hyper is more. Reduced olfactory sensitivity. All right, so many things can lead to this. Anything that blocks air from reaching your olfactory epithelium. If you're plugging your nose because your nose is running, that can interfere with your olfaction. Um, Swollen respiratory epithelium can interfere. But generally, once the airflow returns, your sense of smell returns. It can be permanent if you have head injuries, you damage the neural pathway. Obviously, if you damage the nerves that send the signal to your brain, then you could lose your sense of smell permanently. Also, degeneration happens during Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and one of the signs of that neurodegeneration is a loss of sense of smell. And you'll notice sometimes in older people who have Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, as they lose that sense of smell, they lose that desire. They lose that desire to eat. Food doesn't have as much taste to it. Uh, they'll complain about that. So these are just um, things to notice. Also, with aging, your sense of smell can be reduced. Fewer olfactory neurons are replaced as you get older, and so food doesn't taste as good. You don't smell as well. You don't notice smells as much.